If you want to put a human being in hell, rob them of meaning and purpose, and don't let them kill themselves.
The political class as a whole has fundamentally failed to recognize the real problems of boys and men. There's lots of discussion of AI girlfriends, not much discussion of AI boyfriends, which I think is pretty good evidence that there are differences between men and women. The MTV show 16 and Pregnant had a huge impact on teen pregnancy rates, much more than any recognizable government policy.
I want to start with just a simple question. Men are struggling right now. What has the US done to set men up for failure?
Right. The US has actually, by paying not enough attention to what's happening to working class men, especially in terms of their employment, by neglecting rising issues of men's health, basically turning a blind eye to the way men have fallen behind in higher education. So I guess what I would say is the way you frame the question is more like a sin of commission, right? Is more a kind of deliberate thing. And I think it's much more an accumulated set of sins of omission. I think it's the neglect and the failure to address what were obvious and growing and real problems facing boys and men that has allowed them to deepen and fester in many cases. Now, it's still a sin. The sin of omission is a sin as well as a sin of commission. But it's important to the way I think about this, not to immediately start with a sort of finger pointing, right? Or to assume that it was somehow kind of deliberate. I think it was more, so I think it's more an act of neglect than of kind of malice, if I can put it that way.
Interesting. So this is something that drives my team here at Impact Theory crazy, but I'm a big believer that you point fingers, you need to point fingers, not with malice, but so that you can understand. Before we get to the people and what kind of sin this is, I would love to get into the weeds of, so you gave us some high level stuff of the omissions, but what are the problems? Help set the table for where men are today.
The boys and men have just fallen way behind in education. Every stage from pre-K to post-grad, you see big gender gaps. And in every single case, it's with boys and men behind. So in the average school district in the US now, the boys are almost a grade level behind in English and literacy. If you take the top 10% of high school students measured by GPA, 2/3 are girls, 1/3 are boys. Among the 10% of high school students who do the worst, 2/3 are boys, 1/3 are girls. That plays out in college. College campuses are 60-40 female male now. And in fact, there's a bigger gender gap on college campuses today than there was in the early 70s, in 1972, when we passed Title IX to help women into college. Since then, the gap's closed and then reopened. And so the specific data point is that women are about 16 percentage points more likely now to get a college degree than men, whereas in the 70s, it was 13% more likely that men would get a college degree than women. So we've reversed the old gender gap and then widened it. And so what we see is a growing gap in the share of men and women who are kind of college graduates. So educationally, we just see huge drop. And it's not just in relative terms. Since 2010, college enrollments dropped by about 1.2 million, and that's for all kinds of reasons, good and bad. But of that drop, 1 million is men. So of the 1.2 million drop, 1 million of it's men.
Whoa.
It's much wider HBCUs. There are actually, this is some work we haven't published yet, but there are actually fewer Black men going to HBCU colleges, historically Black colleges today, than there were in 1976.
Whoa.
And there are as many non-Black students going to historically Black colleges, non-Black students, than there are as many as there are Black men. And so when you went to look at it by race, it gets kind of worse. And then just kind of briefly on a couple of other areas. One is that employment, we've just seen male wages stagnating in the middle of the distribution and at the bottom. A little bit better in recent years. Actually, we've seen some good wage growth at the bottom of the distribution just in the last few years. But over the last few decades, really seriously stagnating wages for men. And then in family life, we've just seen an absolute transformation in family life. I'm sure we'll get to this, but for most people who don't have a 4-year college degree, the norm is now for children to be born outside marriage.
Jesus.
So that's a transformation, right? So we only have to go back, 2 or 3 decades, when that wasn't the case. But it's now more usual for a kid to be born outside marriage than inside marriage, unless they have a mum with a 4-year college degree. Now, among those with 4-year college degrees, it's only 10% of kids born outside marriage, but it's the majority of those outside, much higher for Black kids, of course, when you think about race. And so across these different dimensions, what you're seeing, and we can get into some of the things that maybe lie behind these, like these are the data points that I sometimes see as like it's the eruption of the volcano, or it's the tremor of the ground, but there's something happening beneath that. There are some tectonic plates shifting, which I think are more cultural, and I'm pretty sure we're going to get into that. But the data points that kind of pop to the surface are just cratering educational achievement, certainly relative to women, really, really low wages. I should have added declining employment as well. So lower labor market participation, men less likely to work than their fathers. And then just this dramatic shift in family life, which has left a lot of men uncertain about what their role is in the family in 2024.
Yeah, that I think is going to be a big part of this story. So when you think about the first domino, because I think you're right, there's culture, there's policy. If I think from a policy perspective, do you think that Title IX, with obviously wonderful intentions, was the lead domino that began the rise of women, and the unintended consequences became the downfall of men? Or is it something else?
So I think what Title IX has done has mostly been good in terms of just trying to raise the educational aspirations, expectations, and opportunities for girls and women. I think it's important to kind of recognize that was part of the mission of the women's movement, and the same with the rise of women's economic independence. The way I think about this is that not enough attention was paid to well, what if the line keeps going? What happens if the gender gap flips? And will we update our view of the world quickly enough when that happens? And in education, I think what's happened is that the view about what gender equality looks like on college campuses now has not updated with the data. Now, it's interesting that actually Title IX itself doesn't specify women. And so you're now seeing more and more sex discrimination claims under Title IX being brought on behalf of men in college campuses, and with some success. So Title IX is actually now becoming a bit of a double-edged sword if you're a women's rights campaigner. But I'd say the kind of deeper point here is that there has been a failure to recognize that as we've seen kind of women rise in education, and we've seen a massive decline in the share of male teachers and men falling behind, we need to change our approach. We need to start worrying more about the men. We need to start thinking about men as the ones who need more help. And unfortunately, for a generation who are kind of raised in the world where all the attention needed to go to women and girls, it's incredibly hard to update your priors. I think this is a big theme that might underpin a lot of what we're going to talk about, Tom, which is that just it's very hard to update your view of the world when the data changes, especially if it changes quickly. And I just think there's a lot of people who are stuck in their view about what gender equality looks like, and they're stuck in the 80s or the 70s or 90s or whatever, and they just haven't updated it for what the real world looks like in 2024. And that applies to Title IX.
Yeah, that's a note I've taken here and marked twice now, is we're getting the data points, but we're either not responding, or the narrative that we're talking about with the data points, to your point, isn't updating in a way that makes any sense. So getting to the underlying drivers, my base assumptions are that when you try to top-down manipulate a system through incentives, you will get second and third order consequences that are very surprising and often horrific. And we are now engaging in social engineering in the same way that we've engaged in financial engineering. And I think I can give you a very compelling argument on the financial side that we have a moral obligation not to manipulate the currency, and to, at a minimum, have a non-inflatable currency. I think there's a moral argument to be made there. What is your argument on cultural manipulation? Should we be trying to say, hey, we need more women in education, in STEM, in firefighting, in fighter jet pilots. We need more men in HEAL, which you'll know the acronym better than I, but education, nursing, things like that, where traditionally you won't find men. Do we actually need to intervene, or should we leave it alone?
Well, that's a great question that we could spend a lot of time on. And the way I think about this is, ideal world, we shouldn't need to intervene. we should be confident that the patterns that we see emerging are the result of people having pretty unconstrained choices, and that they're revealing their preferences in a way that is consistent with their own ideals and their own values and their own skills. So the question then, so I think the default should be non-intervention. So I think we'll probably share that default. The question then is, okay, where are there circumstances where you would want to intervene, socially engineer, to use that term? And I think that the bar for that should be when you've got pretty strong evidence that there are some artificial barriers here to people, right? So you would worry if you see, for example, only 5% of engineers are women, right? You'd worry about that. You might not necessarily conclude that that's a problem, but you might conclude it is a problem. You might say it matters that engineering has more diversity, or you might not. Or you might say, well, hold on, we suspect that we're leaving some talent on the table here. We suspect there are actually more women who'd be good engineers than is being represented by that 5%. So let's go find out. And I'm very struck by a couple of pieces of evidence here. One is that this is the so-called STEM paradox, which you may have heard of. David Geary and others have done this work, where you actually find that in countries that have done the most in terms of gender equality, the Scandinavian countries, you start to see a slight decline in the share of women going into STEM. And it's a paradox because it's like, well, hold on, you'd expect actually that as you become more and more gender equal, that the share of women going to STEM would just increase. But it looks like it just kind of levels off and even drops a bit. And their interpretation of it is that that probably just means that you're now reflecting actual levels of interest, right? You've reached a point where you can feel confident that actually if women in Sweden are choosing not to go into engineering, it's not because they're being discriminated against or being discouraged from becoming engineers. It's because they don't want to be engineers. And so that's a point at which you can kind of chill a little bit, perhaps, and not say everything has to be 50-50. And so I think it's partly an empirical question, which is like, you look at a pattern and you look at the evidence for it and you say, A, does that pattern look like it might just be emerging as a result of natural choices? And B, do we care? And the other piece of evidence is some work by some psychologists, James Rounds, and the lead author is Rong Su, where they actually looked at personality differences between men and women and interests, especially on the people versus things dimension, which people talk a lot about. On average, men are a bit more into things, women are a bit more into people. And that's true. But of course, it's an average and the distributions overlap. So they said, look, imagine a world where that was driving your choice to either be an engineer or a nurse. What percentage of engineers would be women and what percentage of nurses would be men? And it was about 30%, 25% to 30%. So if you assume that that personality distribution is accurately capturing the preferences of men and women for people and things, and that nursing and engineering are accurate proxies for people and things, then actually you should start to chill at about 25%, 30% men in nursing and 25%, 30% women in engineering. But you shouldn't chill at 5%, and you shouldn't insist on 50%. And of course, that's a very nuanced position to take, right? Most people would say it's either 50% or there's something wrong. Or, yeah, 5% is fine. You know, women's brains don't work that way, which is what I think the men's rights people make the mistake of doing. So on the one hand, you get people who overstate the role of biology and natural differences between men and women in explaining these differences, and others who understate it. So to circle all the way back, I actually think that the case for intervention has to meet a couple of criteria, and this is helpful, I'm thinking out loud here, but is that one, you should feel like there's something there that suggests there's some artificiality, something getting in the way of personal preferences, right? And then secondly, it's an area that we care about. So we might care about nursing, we might care about engineering, but we might not care about deep sea fishing, right? Which is almost all men. And we might decide as a society, the fact that deep sea fishing, like off Alaska, these kind of long trips, or my other favorite example is smoke jumping. Do you know what smoke jumpers are?
I do.
Yeah. They're people who jump out of perfectly serviceable aeroplanes into a raging inferno.
And to give people an idea, David Goggins is a smoke jumper. So that's the kind of, oh yeah. Okay. You want to talk about somebody who financially absolutely does not need to do that, and yet does it? It tells you a lot about the type of person that's drawn to that.
Yeah, it just turns, and it's basically almost all men. There's a few women, and it turns out that if you have an occupation that asks you to, jump out of an airplane into an inferno, you just select on certain characteristics which are almost entirely male. Now, let's say it's hard to get good numbers on it, but let's say 2% of smoke jumpers are women, right? So you can be a smoke jumper if you're a woman. There's nothing stopping you, and they get encouraged if they do it. But as a society, how much do we care about the fact that most of our smoke jumpers are men? I would suggest we don't care very much. All we care about is that they go and put the fire out, and God bless them, and we should honor their courage. But I don't think that is there isn't a social welfare issue at stake there in gender balance. But I think in things like politics, in STEM, tech, I'm interested in your views on tech. Like, I think it does matter to have some representation for social reasons. And so that's the second test. Like, do we care?
Yeah, do we care? So I will say that I think you put your finger on the right thing, which is what we should care about is whether there are barriers to entry. But I think, and this is a problem I see in companies, this is a problem I see in government, you need to state in a very simple sentence, this is the barrier to entry, name it. Don't be vague. Don't say there are barriers to entry. This is the barrier to entry. Tech is an all boys club. Women are more drawn to people and not things. Cool, list them out. And then it becomes a question of, okay, well, how do we remove those barriers to entry? So now if people want to go in, they can. What I have a problem with is I think that incentives come from the right place. I'll just assume incentives come from the right place. I won't even get into the nuttiness of people that are drawn to politics. I will just assume that people have good intentions. But the second and third order consequences of incentivizing something, I think, is where you get derangements. I don't want to turn this into an episode about financial stuff, but you need only look at the financial markets to understand how massively you can derange them by trying to meddle with them in the hopes of stopping there being a big crash and in the hopes of helping there only ever being soft landings and avoiding bad things. I get it, but you completely, the system that we have financially is to steal from everyone to protect wealthy people from ever experiencing a crash. That's what's happened to the financial system. And I'm speaking as one of the wealthy people, and I'm just telling you, it's a terrible system. So now I think you will run into those same second and third order consequences. But at a minimum, you need to name the barrier, not insist on outcomes, which is how we're steering now, and then read the data. So if we see data points that say, hey, this is working for women, that's super helpful. But oh, by the way, this is devastating to men. It's like, okay, now we have to figure out what we're going to do in the face of that. What, if you had to put name to it, what are, and I'll let you pick whatever you think is the most obvious, the least controversial, but what are the barriers to entry for women that we were trying to overcome, and what policies actually overcame them?
Yeah. So in the case of women, the question is probably a little bit easier than it will be maybe if we turn to men, going the other way, because for long periods of human history, of course, women weren't allowed to do some of these jobs. So the barrier to entry into certain professions was you weren't permitted to do so, right? And so women couldn't go to medical school until the second half of the 20th century, right? So this is why the women's rights movement kind of makes sense as a phrase and the men's rights movement doesn't, right? Because women did actually lack rights. They couldn't, get a credit card without their husband's permission until 1974.
Still bananas.
And you see that, and it's really interesting. I was talking to a friend recently, and like her mom was the kind of first chemistry professor at a kind of college, right? And she, my friend, is a dean of a school at a university, and no one thinks twice about the fact that 50% of professors are women now, increasing, like getting towards 50% deans and presidents of colleges. No one thinks anything of that, but a generation ago, it was hard for women, and they actually faced legal. So in some cases, there were literally laws and or institutional laws preventing them. The second barrier was that because those professions, let's take any you want, but science, etc., because they were so male and had been so male, they had a male culture. Now, what does that mean? Now, very hard to measure, but there's some pretty clear evidence that until you get to about 30% representation, and both ways, by the way, an occupation will tend to have a culture that is a bit more male and a bit more female in communication style, in the level of competitiveness, etc. And so, like being the one woman in engineering class of 100. That was hard, right? Just as it's hard to be the one man in a education school now. So I think the second barrier was just that there were these cultural, and there was some stigma and resistance. I actually think those have both been largely addressed. So then the third question is, are there barriers for women, say in tech or in some consulting or law, etc., which I would say now they're less about them as women and more about the fact that women have very different patterns of caring and working, especially in their 30s. And there, I think it's less about the fact they're women, but they are disproportionately affected as women because they still do most of the early years childcare. And so that is preventing a lot of women rising up career ladders, because those career ladders were designed for people who didn't have caring responsibilities. And again, that's no one's fault. It's not some plot. It's not a plot to exclude women at this point. And it's not active discrimination, right? The evidence that women are discriminated against in any of those spaces is now zero, right? So we're not talking about a discrimination problem anymore. And we're not talking about a rule problem now. We're talking about either a cultural problem or the inadvertent consequence of career ladders that are just designed for people who don't have kids, basically, or who don't have to worry about their kids. And so that's now the new battleground, I think. But as I say, I'm very struck by the fact that's true of single-sex parents as well, right? So that's not about women anymore. That's just about having caring responsibilities getting in the way of your career uplift, and that's a kind of different question. So that would be my sort of threefold attempt to is this kind of history really of the barriers that kind of women have faced, and a history of progress that we've made over the last 50 years, extraordinary progress on getting women into those professions. Like half the doctors, half the lawyers, half the scientists are now women. That's an incredible achievement in a very short period of time.
Okay, so it's interesting. A lot of this comes down to what are the goals you're trying to achieve. When I hear you talk, and as somebody who is married to a very successful female entrepreneur who does not have kids, we certainly don't have a traditional family structure. Yet, when I step back and I look at everything that's happening at a societal level, birth rates dropping, which not to over dramatize, but literally the human civilization cannot move forward if we don't continue having kids. And if you look back over different empires that have crumbled, it's almost always tied to a radical decrease in population, either because of birth rate, famine, pandemic, whatever the case may be. But when you have a precipitous drop in birth rate, you are really in trouble. And when I look at what's happening right now, this is a tale of second and third order consequences. So we give, rightly so, we pursue women being able to control their own reproduction. I love that the most, as somebody who leveraged birth control very effectively to create the life that I want. I'm not mad about it, but at the same time, you now have this breakdown in what is the male role. And I think that that's the thing that lurks behind the scenes in terms of what's going wrong for men. You remove these barriers for women, amazing. They're able to control their reproduction, amazing. They go into the workforce, to your point about getting access to all that talent, not wanting to leave anything on the sidelines, amazing. However, it's broken the way that religion and the family transmitted a set of values that said, this is everybody's role, this is what you do, and this is how you please God. And I'm not religious, but I see the value in the transmission of that meme. And so everybody understands what their role is. There are some frustrations, obviously. But as that narrative breaks down, because to a woman, it's like, there's nothing you can do. God has touched you with this blessing of being able to create a child. To have children is to honor God. And what a magical role that you play. Man, you are here to protect your family, to provide for your family, and that is how you honor God. Okay, cool. Like, everybody knows what they're supposed to do. Now, all of a sudden, you make progress and religion starts to diminish in certainly Western culture in terms of people following those precepts in order to live the good life. So not as many people are living in accordance with the teachings of the religions. You begin to have a breakdown of what is my role. High quality protein is the most important part of any diet. That's why you'll always find my freezer stocked with ButcherBox. They deliver it right to my doorstep, and the shipping is always free. In my family, it is critical that we know exactly what's in our food. We trust ButcherBox because their cuts are humanely raised with no antibiotics or added hormones. So if you're ready to make fueling your body with high-quality protein easier than ever, head to the show notes and click the link for ButcherBox. Sign up for ButcherBox today. Go to butcherbox.com/impact and use code IMPACT at checkout and enjoy your choice of bone-in chicken thighs, top sirloins, or salmon in every box for an entire year, plus get $30 off. Again, that's butcherbox.com/impact and use code IMPACT at checkout. If you want to indulge in a glass or two of alcohol, but don't want to feel crappy the next day, you should try Z-Biotics. Z-Biotics, the pre-alcohol probiotic drink, is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Z-Biotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make Z-Biotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly as always, and you will feel your best the next day. Go to zbiotics.com/impact to get 15% off your first order when you use IMPACT at checkout. Z-Biotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember, just head to zbiotics.com/impact and use the code IMPACT at checkout for 15% off. Thank you to Z-Biotics for sponsoring this episode and all of our good times. And so I will put the question to you this way: given the second and third order consequences of that breakdown, is it actually progress to try to eliminate all these barriers to entry and make sure that women and men have maximum flexibility? Is that actually advantageous?
Well, just a data point that struck me recently is that actually men are now more likely than women to say that getting married and having kids is important to them.
Yup, I am not surprised by that.
That's a reversal, and it speaks, I think, to this sense of like self and hopelessness. And I want to do two things in response. One is just to note how you framed this, which is you talked about the rise of women in two important ways. One in terms of control of fertility, and the second in terms of kind of control of economic destiny because of the rise of economic power for women. And you said amazing, 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 and then you said, however. What does that mean about the change in roles? What does it mean for the roles of men, etc.? And the amazing however move that you just made there is what's been lacking. And that there's a real resistance to the idea that you can have changes in society that are on net amazing, but that still have second or third order consequences, which can be challenging, difficult. And that it's the ultimate cultural naivety to think that massive social and economic changes don't come, that you don't break some glass along the way, right? And you have to deal with the negative consequences of even overall positive social changes. There's a kind of blindness to that, which is a real problem. And in this case, I think you're right that what's happened is that the sense of what the roles were, that's just been absolutely transformed incredibly quickly. The more I've thought about this, the deeper I think this transformation really goes since the 60s and the 70s. So since the changes in ability to control fertility you've mentioned, and the economic rise of women. So just to put a point, it's like 40% of women today in the US earn more than the average man. So that's not 50%, it's not full equality, but that compares to 13% of women in 1979. And so just since 1979, you know, the chances of a woman earning more than the average man has almost quadrupled, has tripled, right? And it's gone from being quite unusual to being pretty normal. And the result of that has been, I think, to just completely upend the traditional scripts. The scripts that were provided, sure, by religion, but I think more importantly in this case by a kind of family role. So my dad, like, he knew his role. Right? He was all kinds of things, but he knew his basic core role was economic provider. That was his core role. And my mum knew her core role, which was to raise the kids and be the main person on the domestic front. She also worked. They had an incredibly equal relationship. but it was an equal relationship based on almost unquestioned roles, right? They, as you said, they knew their role. I think what's happened is that we've expanded the script for women. We've said, let's tear up this old script of wife and mother and replace it with a new script of you can be whatever you want to be, right? The sky's the limit. Massive empowerment, a hugely positive message of empowerment. You go, girl, you know, etc. And that has just, I think, been wonderful to watch. And so what we've said to girls and women effectively is like, you're not trapped by the old script that your mums or grandmoms had. You can be anything. We've replaced the old female script with a new script about empowerment and independence. We've torn up the old male script, protector, provider, breadwinner, and we've replaced it with absolutely nothing. There is no new script. There is no new role. And we've just, I think we're in this really difficult transition phase now. And what I would say is that there's a real difficult balance now because a lot of people are hearkening back to the era when we knew our role, we knew our place, when things were clearer, you know, when we had institutions telling us what to do. And the hankering for that is real and in many cases noble, but it is I think it's ill-fated. Turning the clock back is not generally very successful. So I think by contrast, we should be going forward. We need to keep going, and we need to adjust our views about the role of men in accordance with the rise of women, rather than thinking that for men to rise, we need to kind of somehow turn back the clock on women. That is, in my view, not effective, but also immoral. So we are where we are, and right now we're in a really difficult moment, right? The average 27-year-old guy has much less of a clue about what he's supposed to be doing. He has a pretty good clue about what he's not supposed to do, interestingly. Now we do have a long list of don'ts for young men, but he has very little sense about what, as a man, he's supposed to do. And that's created a huge vacuum in our culture, and it's been filled in some unfortunate ways in many quarters, because there's a massive cultural question hanging over the role of men, which we're not responsibly answering.
Okay, so this idea of moving forward, I think, is really important. I'd love to get clarity from you about what a positive vision of masculinity looks like. One thing at a high level I want to see, and as an entrepreneur, this is how I engage with this debate, which I want to see men and women compete all out on a fair playing field. And right now, there's a sense of like men should not be pushing as hard, don't follow those natural instincts for competition or for really responding to gamification, which I think is a big part of why more men play video games. Man, I hyper respond to gamification in a way that my wife just does not. And I have a feeling that will carry out across the broad population. One, how do you feel about just like, all right, boys and girls, go at it in a fair fight, but go at it full bore, every individual, regardless of male or female, you should be trying to win your ideal job. And if that isn't part of the path forward of defining masculinity in a positive sense, what is?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is, well, there's so many things I could say here. The first thing is to not end up sort of shrinking ourselves. I think there's been this dangerous trend in some quarters to say that somehow for women to rise and to expand, men need to fall or to contract, that men need to become less in order for women to become more. Less, sure of themselves, less assertive, less competitive, less physical, whatever. Just don't be less of you, right? I think that's one of the problems with some of the tropes we see around kind of toxic masculinity and mansplaining and so on. Which is not to say there isn't some substance there, but that the message that too many kind of men are getting is, could you just be less you? Could you be less male? And instead, I think what we need to be doing is kind of creating a situation where, like, we're in shared environments. And if there is ways in which, on average, kind of men act in a particular way, as opposed to girls or women, that's okay. It's just as okay. And one example that you just alluded to is that men and boys are, on average, a bit more competitive, right? And they respond. This is why the gamification thing is important. They respond a little bit better to competition. And they're more seeking that kind of competition. Well, and girls and women a little bit less so. right? The evidence of that is really clear. Men and boys are also quite a bit more risk taking on average than women and girls. Is one good or is one bad? No, is the answer. But what we don't want is to lose some of that magic, right? Some of that magical difference by somehow saying there's something wrong with attribute A or B, risk-taking or competition, because it's associated with men. What we need to do is to say those are not the only attributes that matter, and those shouldn't run the whole economy. So I'll give you two examples. One is from business, which is, we may have talked about this before, but there's some evidence that companies that are run by women, with CEO and COO, CFO female, they're a little bit less profitable, but they're also less likely to go under. Those that are run by men are on average a bit more profitable, but they're also a bit more likely to go under. So I know it's a little bit riskier, right? Now, so you could conclude from that, you could say, oh, we shouldn't have women in leadership because their companies are just boring, right? We don't get the same entrepreneurship. We don't get the risk taking. Sure, it'll be fine, but the profits will never be that great. So you could say, like, we shouldn't have women in the boardroom for that reason. Or you could say, look, these guys are just recklessly acting out and doing boyhood fantasies, and they're crashing all our companies. Yes, sure, they're more profitable when they work, but look, look how many companies. Or you could say, maybe we need a bit of both. Maybe that's a reason why you need a mix in a boardroom, right? And here again, I need to say that the distributions overlap. But the other example, I was in a school recently, and this female choral teacher said she needed the boys, as a middle school, she needed the boys to sing soprano. And none of the boys wanted to do that. They're very self-conscious. They're going through puberty, and they didn't want to do that. And the girls were around as well. And so anyway, so she did two things. She kicked the girls out and just said, okay, I'm just going to work with the boys. And then what she said was, we're going to have a competition to see who can sing the highest. And I'm going to give a prize to the boy that can sing the highest. Immediately, they're all doing it. So I love that story, because what's that saying? Here's a teacher that's recognizing sometimes there's a space for single sex, but also, okay, so boys are more competitive. Let's use that instinct for being more competitive for a positive end. Rather than saying it's bad to be competitive, let's say, okay, boys are more competitive. How do we channel that to good social ends? I know it's a long, kind of slightly rambling answer, but there's something there about just not apologizing for those differences and finding ways to channel that energy and those differences in ways that kind of benefit all of us, rather than pathologizing either. So a patriarchy might be a society where more typically feminine traits are seen as lesser than, and a matriarchy would be where it was the other way around. And we don't want either of those things. We really don't want a patriarchy or a matriarchy. We want a society that genuinely honors the differences. And I talked about risk and courage. We talked about smoke jumpers. Awesome that we have people that are willing to do that. And the fact that they're almost all men, amazing. And we shouldn't have any apology about saying that.
Yeah, totally agree. So when you were talking about the business corporations run by women are going to be less profitable, but more stable, and then the flip for ones run by men, and then you said what we want is a little bit of both, or maybe what we want, I think is what you said, we want a little bit of both. How do we decide? Because as somebody who builds companies, invests in companies, I would say I literally do not care if the person running the company is male or female. I care very much about the metrics that we agreed that we are going to hit and who is more capable of hitting those metrics. So I don't care if every single Fortune 500 company is run by a man. I don't care if every Fortune 500 company is run by a woman. What I care about is whether those people were allowed to compete in a relatively unbridled fashion. I'm not a no government guy, so I do believe in sensible regulation. So within sensible regulation, I would want them to really be able to go in and compete. Would you be uncomfortable in a world where the men and women were allowed to compete sensibly with an even starting point of education? I'm talking when they're 5 years old, but that all Fortune 500 companies in the end are run by men. Would that bother you?
It would bother me for the reasons that we talked about earlier, which is, let's assume that there's a certain set of attributes that make you more likely to be a good CEO of a Fortune 500 company, right? And let's assume that the market is selecting reasonably rationally on that, right? And so that the people who are getting to be CEOs are being selected against a certain set of characteristics. If every single one of those CEOs is male, then I think you'd have very good reason to worry that the number of women who also have those characteristics is not being reflected in those numbers, that something is happening to artificially hinder the progress of women up the corporate hierarchy such that we are missing some potential leadership talent.
All right. But if you looked at everything
seems...
and you did not see any barriers to entry, would it bother you?
If you didn't see any barriers to entry, well, this is where I think things get a little bit difficult around representation. I'm thinking about politics as well, right? Maybe you could apply this to politics, but I don't want to seem like I'm kind of moving away from the question. I'm just thinking of other areas where does representation matter in and of itself in certain roles? Because the absence of women in CEO positions, whether we like it or not, sends a cultural signal to other women and to girls that that's not a job for you.
But where do you think we should solve that problem? So here would be my pitch. That is true. I think representation actually matters, but I don't think it matters enough to engage in social engineering, except at the family level. At the family level, I want to see parents tell their kids, hey, just because you don't see somebody that looks like you in this thing, I assure you, this is about, can you get so good at something that people can't stop you from doing it? And look at mom and dad. Like, we do these things that are very unexpected, and we did that because we got so good that people couldn't stop us from doing it. Now, if that message were propagated with ferocity, and then people were educated in a way that didn't make me want to headbutt the head of the educational system, then I would be here for it. But the thing I worry about is people are so concerned about there being representation that they end up doing the social engineering that has all these crazy distorting knock-on effects that end up ultimately being worse.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's why in the end, I end up being against, as a general proposition, quotas, whether they're kind of hard or soft quotas. Obviously, that can work in different ways in, say, a business setting. Now, of course, in Europe and many countries, there are quotas, soft or hard, that are set. And in some Scandinavian countries, by law, a certain percentage of the directors of publicly traded companies have to be women now. And so you do get these kind of, that's a hard quota system, but you also get soft quota systems where it's kind of implicit that you're trying to get to a certain number. So that's not the solution, because it doesn't actually address the problem. It addresses the symptoms of the problem artificially. It actually skips over the problem. So rather than asking ourselves the question, if we think that the representation of a certain group, and it could be people of color, it could be whatever, if we think it's suspiciously low, right, it's low enough to make us think that doesn't look like it could have happened unless there's something going on here. Like, if all board members of Fortune 500 companies are white men, which they were not that long ago, that's reason to be suspicious about the fact that there are things getting in the way of Black, Hispanic women and men getting into those. Now, could that be the education system all the way back? Maybe. Could it be what happens in the labor market? Maybe. Could it be middle management? Maybe. Could it be discrimination in hiring? Whether advertisement? Maybe. Let's go find out. And let's try and do everything we can to kind of remove those artificial barriers. But you wouldn't solve that by saying, okay, we're just going to have X% of that group in there, because actually in the end, that doesn't solve what might be leading to that outcome. And I think it's just so it's impractical. But in politics, I feel differently, because in a representative democracy, the people who are making the decisions about the laws under which we live, I think there's a strong moral case that there should be decent levels of representation in a representative democracy. And so there, I think there's a case for some pretty strong social engineering in order to try and get to that and get to it quicker than might happen naturally. But I don't think that argument that I would make in politics and in representative democracies applies to, say, boardrooms or other places where I think the argument would go the other way.
Ooh, okay. So how do you social engineer then? Are you going to go to a district and say, you guys have to elect a woman?
That's what the Labour Party did. in the UK where I'm from, and it's very interesting to see what happens now. This is a really good test case actually of the theory. So let's put it on the table. So when Margaret Thatcher became a prime minister, only 5% of members of parliament were women. So that tells you something about Margaret Thatcher.
No kidding.
At the time, right? I mean, this is extraordinary for all kinds of reasons, but just to have come from like 1 in 20 of even MPs were women, and she managed to become not only leader of the Conservative Party, but prime minister for most of my childhood. Now it's about a third of MPs are women, and the majority of all the other parties, except the Conservatives, are now women. So actually, there's above 50% women in all the other parties. But the Labour Party still has a policy of women-only shortlists. And so in certain constituencies or districts, to use the US language, they actually say that district can only have a woman. And so it's exactly what you just said, which is that like you have to, so the primary in the district in the US could only be women. And so it's very interesting now that the Labour Party is actually slightly more female than male. What do they do about that policy? And that's something that's being kind of discussed right now. And I think you can get rid of the policy. My view is, well, mission accomplished, right? But once the policy's in place, it's really difficult to get rid of.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was in favor of all women shortlists at the time to just try and move the needle a bit on women's representation in Parliament. But job done, and pretty quickly in terms of Labour Party. So that great, now we can get rid of them. But they haven't gotten rid of them yet. And so that's a good test of whether or not you were serious about this just as a means to an end rather than an end in itself.
Wow. I am shocked that you were for where you are quite literally distorting the democratic process. Now, this may be your British upbringing, but to an American ear, that hits gnarly. That people, I already have a problem with the way that the two-party system works and the way that, like, we effectively just witnessed the Democratic Party give no option. Like, hey, it's going to be Kamala Harris, and that's that. I hope you enjoy. That's really bad if people are like, you can vote for anyone as long as it's a woman. It's like the Henry Ford quote: "You can have any color you want for your car as long as it's black." It's like, whoa, that in politics, man, that's pretty crazy. So make me a believer. How is it possibly a good idea to tell the voting public, you guys are too stupid to elect the right person, and so we're going to artificially narrow the choice to one gender?
Yeah, so of course, what they could do is in these seats where there was a women-only shortlist, and so the Labour candidate was going to be a woman in those constituencies. So you could, of course, vote for the Conservative candidate or the Liberal Democrat candidate who might be male. But you're right that what's happening there is that the party is deciding that it cares sufficiently about representation that it's going to change its own internal processes. It's going to socially engineer its candidate selection process to significantly increase the share of women. Because what they were finding is that the constituency parties, the districts, who made the decision about it. So it's not like a primary system. It was made by kind of a pretty small group of kind of local party members, but they weren't choosing that many women, and so there was some top-down social engineering. Now, of course, that's been true in lots of countries. Actually, why is Mexico 50-50 female male in its parliament now? Because of quotas. And so it's something that's not very controversial in other countries. The reason I was in favor of it was because, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
It's very common. And it's actually if you look at the countries that have just like Rwanda, Mexico, that have just made massive, just like overnight almost changes in the share of women in politics, they've almost always had some sort of quota system put in place as an accelerant to get there. And it clearly works as an accelerant. Now, are there downsides? We can obviously discuss that. But the reason I was in favor of it until now I think that mission accomplished, and so it can go now, is because it just felt a bit stuck. It felt like the political system was stuck, and that the lack of representation of women in politics, specifically just in politics, in a representative democracy, was a problem in and of itself. It wasn't just a symptom of another problem, which is what we've been talking about up to the point. It was a problem in itself.
But how do we have a representation problem when Margaret Thatcher was prime minister? It's the same way that it feels to me when we say that racism is as bad in America as it's ever been, except for the fact that we just had a 2-term black president. It's like, I cannot reconcile that those two things are true. I can say, hey, it's still a problem and we need to keep going. Yeah, word. But I cannot say that it's just as bad as it's ever been. So anybody African-American would look at that in America and be like, oh my God, this is amazing. Representation in the extreme. Anybody that's a woman in the UK looking at Margaret Thatcher being in office, not briefly, being in office for a long ass time at one of the most pivotal moments in the history of most people that are alive today, right? So obviously post World War II, but this was not a flash in the pan. This was not just sort of a forgotten time in history. I mean, the Falkland War, this is somebody that was like in the thick of it. So any young girl growing up is like, I can be that, obviously. So why in a post Margaret Thatcher world would we need quotas to up that number?
Yeah, and to be clear, again, it's quotas at the party level. It's because despite Margaret Thatcher and her rise, the share of women in politics remained very low and was growing pretty slowly. And so one party, the Labour Party, the most progressive party, decided to take it upon itself to accelerate the share of women into it through social engineering.
What do you think was the barrier to entry? Because to me, it seems like the barrier is voters. Is there something that I'm missing? Was there a barrier in the party itself?
It seemed to be in the selection process. So it seemed to be in the kind of, I'll try and use US language, like in the district that was deciding who was going to be their Labour candidate, that there was a distinct skew in favor of the male candidates. Now, maybe it's because the male candidates were better and they were making kind of good choices, right? That we can't get inside that kind of the black box of the decisions that were happening in every constituency across the country. And it was felt, and I agreed with it at the time, that actually we needed a short-term accelerant to get the share of women in politics to a point where we could feel comfortable about the fact that politics felt like it was a place that women could go. It also, as a result of the share of women in politics, did start to change the culture of British politics. And it started to change the provision of things like childcare in the House of Commons, the ability to kind of take time off. I don't think that David Cameron would have taken paternity leave as Prime Minister in 2010 if the culture of British politics hadn't changed sufficiently. And maybe we can get back to whether you think that was a good or a bad thing. But let me turn the tables a little bit. If you felt confident that there were no legal barriers or formal barriers to women entering politics in the US, as now, and every single member of the House of Representatives and every single senator and every single cabinet minister was male, if we had an all-male Congress, would that trouble you?
The first question I would ask is, what is the outcome that I'm aiming at? For me, it's human flourishing. Next, I would ask, are we achieving human flourishing? If yes, I have no problem whatsoever. Literally none. If no, then I start asking, okay, something has to change. What is going to be the thing that changes? And on my list of very early questions to ask would be, is this being a male-dominated field creating a problem? Are we being blindsided to the way that women think? And could that be just wildly advantageous to us moving towards human flourishing? But that's the primary question that I'm asking is, where am I trying to end up? What reason do I have to believe that the following experiment would actually yield that outcome? And then, P.S., if we were to run this experiment and go, yes, we're going to try this, and right now, let's say we're at 12% women, by the time we're 20%, 25%, I'm going to check in and be like, are we now moving towards human flourishing? Because if we're not, if moving that wildly, because that would be a true doubling, if moving that wildly in that direction is not yielding an outcome, I will just tell you right now from a entrepreneur up against the market perspective, you have not identified the real solution. So at that point, I would have said, it has not led us to where we want to go. What I fear we have is, this is a luxury belief. People are complaining about a luxury item. We are in such an amazing time in human history that people can actually worry about the gender makeup of their government instead of fighting tooth and claw just to exist, that's the tale of human history. So yeah, I would be really thoughtful to map out, here's where I want to go. Here is what I think is causing the problem. Again, if there is a problem. And then this is a hypothesis. More women will help us. And I'm going to, when I bring women on, this is a key that people always lose sight of. I'm going to run this experiment and I expect this outcome. So once I have doubled the number of women in parliament, I would expect to see this improvement. Do I see that improvement? And if I don't, you have not identified the right problem. But people just get so myopically focused on the outcome they actually want is 50% representation or 70% representation, or secretly it's being driven by people that want 100% representation. And just like any man that says women in politics, that's terrible and they can never be a good leader, they are a moron. There's nothing that I have seen at the population level that tells me that that would be true. But it is equally true to say that men are all toxic and we have to get them out of politics. Both are stupid.
Yeah. So there's two issues at stake here. One is the just a kind of moral claim about who should be making the laws that we all have to live under, and should we have a degree of representation about the people who are making the laws, and the second question is, are we making better laws for human flourishing? So there's more of a kind of performance side of it too. Is this institution performing well against this outcome, right? Which you've said is human flourishing. And I guess you would feel the same about juries, right? So if all our juries were men, if everybody's tried under a jury and it's 12 good men, right, to use the old, and we didn't have women on juries as we do have to now, I'm pretty sure we have to. Actually, I'm saying this and someone needs to fact check this, but I don't know what the rules are, but I don't think we can have all male juries or all female juries. And you can imagine some trials where that would really matter. But you'd feel the same about that. If all the members of juries in trials were male, if you felt confident that justice was being done and that this justice system was working and that people were being treated fairly, that men and women, whatever, were being treated equally fairly by these all-male juries, then you wouldn't have a problem with it.
Not in the
Whereas
slightest.
I think what I would say
because before you get to that, let me say why I don't think that I would have a beef, why I would not have a beef with that. It is an adversarial system that creates that pool of jurors. So you have both sides saying, I need this juror on, and both sides saying, I absolutely cannot have a given juror. And so they're battling to make sure that they have a pool that they think is most likely to win for their side. If they both agree, this is all women, this is all men, this is all Asian people, this is all black people, whatever, rad, I don't care. That is the nature of the adversarial system. And that's what I'm talking about in politics. That's what I'm talking about in business. I want people to compete against the marketplace. So we pick a metric for the nation, whether it's happiness ratings, whether it's GDP, whatever, but we say, here are the metrics that we think matter. And here are the probably policies way before people. Here are the policies that are getting us there. And here are the people that happen to represent those policies that we believe in. And by the way, you, the people, via a representative democracy, I'm here for that. But that's how we're getting there. So yes, whatever the constitution of humans, whether it's race or gender, that move us towards the metrics that we want, human flourishing by my vote, then that is what it is.
Yeah. So you're being entirely and consistently instrumental about this and consequentialist about it, and applying that to all these institutions. Whereas I'm doing a carve out for representative democracy from that, and saying that I think it's a different creature than some of these other institutions we've talked about. Whereas I think you're applying the same moral logic to politics as you are to business. As you
I
are to
have
other
a feeling
institutions, and I'm
you are
applying a
as
different
well. I don't think you are. And let me ask a clarifying question. Do you want women in government for the sake of representing the people's wishes, Or do you want women in government simply because you believe that it is a moral good to have like literally pure representation? So if the women that made it into parliament voted exactly the same as their male counterparts, brought exactly the same ideas as their male counterparts, would you be perfectly fine with that? Or would you say, okay, this actually didn't do the thing I wanted, which was to get a feminine perspective?
Yeah, that's a great clarifying question, because I presume in my argument for greater gender representation in something like politics that is bringing different perspectives to the process of making laws. I'm presuming that.
And that is a good thing.
And the same in juries. And that is a good thing.
Because it has a good outcome, or for some other reason?
Because it's a good outcome.
So
yeah, that it has a good outcome.
You and I are saying the exact same thing.
Case.
So we are both saying, I have an outcome that I desire, and I think by doing this thing, we get that outcome. The only difference is I'm saying, I think social engineering is a bad way. You're going to guess poorly. You're going to think it's this, but there are second and third order consequences that probably don't lead you there. And you're saying, no. There are things that we can know, and getting both perspectives is inherently more likely to lead us to the desired outcome. But we're both instrumental. We are both driving towards an outcome.
Yeah, that's correct. It's that I guess I don't feel very confident that I could identify external metrics of performance against which we could kind of measure the success. And so I'm kind of betting quite heavily on the fact that there will be improved outcomes as a result of diversity, such that I would not be comfortable with an all-male Congress, even if we could somehow invent some sort of external measure that said, okay, well, that Congress is doing just as well as one with women in it, because I don't know how we would ever know. And so because I don't think we would ever know, I think we have to err on the side of, in representative democracy, to be clear, on the side of representation, because then at least we can eliminate the risk that we're underperforming if we think that diversity is bringing more performance to it. But I will say one more thing, and this might bridge us to some other issues, to some other areas that I worry about, which is, it's back to, we had the conversation about kind of barriers to entry into a kind of particular profession. And one of the ones I identified was, if you don't see, this is one of the feminist mantras is, you can't be it if you can't see it. I think there's some truth to that. I think that one of the barriers that there might be to entering a certain kind of profession or a certain activity might be that you just don't see anybody like you doing it. And it's one of the reasons I worry, for example, about the kind of lack of male teachers, because at a certain point, if you never see men in the classroom, then you grow up thinking that's not something men do. And I worry a lot about that. I worry that it gets harder and harder to get people to go into those professions if they just don't see anyone like them. So I do also worry about these tipping point effects and these can't be it if you can't see it effects. And so if you have a profession that's all male or all female, it just gets really hard to persuade people to go into that profession if it's going against that grain. And in some professions, I think that really matters. So we talked a lot about politics where I think it matters, but I think it matters in something like education or the mental health professions, which are increasingly becoming female. Does it matter if there aren't any male teachers? Like, how would we feel about an all-female teaching profession? I wouldn't feel great about it. And there's a number of reasons I wouldn't, but one of the reasons that's relevant to this discussion that I wouldn't feel great about it is because it's going to get much harder to persuade a boy that he could become a teacher if that's really what his vocation could be and what his skill set would lead him to, if he would be literally the only male teacher in the US, right? It's just going to get very, very hard to persuade him. So there is a bit of a vicious and a virtuous cycle here, which again, I don't think leads you to say you have to have quotas or you have to have 50%. But I think it means you have to be attentive to areas where there is a very low representation of one gender, and worry a lot that there's something going on there that is leading to such low representation, and try to do everything you can to reduce those barriers. So you shouldn't fetishize 50% and you shouldn't have quotas, but you should worry if it's 3%, if it's an area you care about. So we've already talked about smoke jumpers, don't care, broadly speaking. Education, politics, science, medicine, kind of do care if it's only 3% of one sex or the other. And as I say, that's partly because it then just becomes intergenerationally a vicious cycle. It took ages for me to persuade one of my sons that men could be doctors because he'd only seen female doctors. And then we saw a male doctor. I can't remember how old he was, but like 7 or something. And we went, and on the way home, he said, "Dad, that I didn't know men could be doctors,
Wow.
could be physicians."
My, how things have
And I
changed.
said, what are you talking about? Because he'd only ever seen, and so of course, he'd drawn the rational conclusion. If you only see people of one sex doing a thing, you naturally assume that that's a thing that that sex does. And if you're of the opposite sex, you assume that's not for me. And that's a problem in itself, I think. I don't know quite how to think about that in terms of the numbers or the shares. And as I say, there does seem to be some evidence for like a 30% tipping point. But I worry about that just in terms of the messages we're sending to the next generation. And that's a social norm effect rather than it's not a legal barrier or a formal barrier, but it can be an informal barrier if you think you're going to be a freak by choosing to be the one female engineer or the one male primary school teacher.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that all of the problems of letting people sort themselves out into what they want to do, the barriers for women, they go away when you remove any and all laws that say that they can't be financially independent. So we've already talked about that. That's an absolute must. Glad it happened. It has happened, certainly here in the US. And then the next one is, now that women have control over their reproductive timing, you do those two things, and now greedy capitalists are going to take over. Because if somebody comes into my company and they are smarter than the next person, they are more capable than the next person, and they happen to have a uterus, I'm here for it. Like, I don't care. I just want the most intelligent, driven, like, person that's a great teammate, that elevates the other people here, makes them play at a higher level. Like, I just don't care. So I feel like people want to do the social engineering rather than just letting the fact that we've solved that problem already run its course. And the fact that we have in places quotas, that we have scholarships, incentives, and things like that, that are meant to act as accelerants, and quite frankly, they do. But now you get this huge pendulum swing that is inevitably going to go too far. And then you start doing damage, which is how we open this conversation. Men are struggling. And I would say, after researching you now multiple times, that what I see is all the things that were meant to be accelerants for girls worked extraordinarily well. But now the narrative that we told was that men were creating these barriers, men are the problem, and now men are withdrawing, they are tapping out, they are not engaging. And so all that talent that we were worried about leaving on the sideline, we've just changed. It's now not the females that are being left on the sideline, it's the men. And the thing I would hope people take away from my worldview, that they are welcome to reject, but I would love them to understand it, is just that when you tinker with a system that is as complicated as what jobs are filled by what gender, that, oh dear Lord, there's no way you're going to avoid very problematic second and third order consequences. Now, what's my solution? My solution is, this is to a hammer, every problem is a nail. I understand that. But to me, the solution is storytelling. You need to tell stories of the little boy who never sees a female or never sees a male doctor and thinks that men can't be doctors. And then, oh my gosh, you have this story and that book makes its way into households, or they read it online, or they see the cartoon or whatever. That kind of telling a new story so that people can see beyond the limitations that they see now, I think that's incredibly potent and is probably one of the greatest services that art can perform for society.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. And actually, I've just been writing a little bit about Kamala Harris's pick for her VP, her running mate, Tim Walz. He's getting a lot of attention for having been he's a former high school teacher and a high school football coach. And my son is just starting his career as a public school teacher, also social studies, which is what Tim Walz got. And he texted me to say, "Hey, Dad, I might end up being vice president." And it was just a kind of jokey text, but it was very interesting to see, like, okay, you can be a high school teacher, you can be a public school teacher. So the storytelling around him, I think, is going to be quite important and quite interesting. So here we agree is that actually the stories you tell about what kinds of people can be teachers, nurses, tech, etc., I think is important. But I guess that a lot of this will come down to what we think, what tinkering means, right? So one of the things I'm very interested in is the programs that are really encouraging young men to consider teaching as a career by having kind of role models go into schools and talk to them. I'm actually in favor of even some financial incentives to get more men to go into teaching. I suspect that's where we'll disagree, just as there are some financial incentives for getting women into STEM. So it's not a quota, it's an incentive, and it's deliberately trying to incentivize an underrepresented group, in this case men in teaching, to go into teaching when they wouldn't otherwise through a kind of financial incentive. Sounds like we might agree that it's not great if there aren't any men in teaching, and it's down to 23% now. It's 33% when Tim Walz became a teacher in the Reagan era, and falling. I would be in favor of some tinkering, to use your term, if that means some financial incentives, some messaging, some storytelling, some soft power around trying to make teaching a more attractive profession to men. Also making lateral moves into teaching more attractive, because a lot of men come in later from other professions, and so you do that explicitly to try and get more men in. What would be your reaction to that? That's the kind of tinkering I'm in favor of, to try and address that gender imbalance, and it sounds like you'd probably be against, and you just want to let the market keep doing its thing around teaching, which would probably mean fewer and fewer men.
Yeah. So that would very much be my instinct is, okay, there's an outcome that I want because I share your desire for it not to be only women. So the question is, how do I culturally incentivize people to recognize that it would be useful? Now, I don't trust myself enough and my ability to see what is true where I would want to tinker. So one base assumption you have to understand about me for anything that I say to make sense is that I think every human being needs to wildly distrust themselves. And it is mostly, not entirely, but it's mostly in the aggregate that we find our way to something sensible. So I would want the opportunity to write stories, tell stories, do podcasts, all of that, put ideas out into the system and say, hey, I really believe that we need more men as school teachers. We really need more women as pilots, whatever. I don't believe that one. But if I did, that I would put that idea out into the marketplace, and I would very much be as passionate as I can, tell that story as convincingly and compellingly and just data rich as I can, get it in front of as many people as possible, and then get them at a grassroots level with their own children to go to the school and make demands. I know your own story is that you ended up going to a school because the new headmaster came around and said, hey, dear neighborhood, I need you to send your kids to this ailing school that I am going to turn around, but I need you guys to send me your kids. And that kind of grassroots, a parent making the decision about their own child, that's what I'm talking about. So putting the idea into the world, fighting for it as just passionately and convincingly as possible. But then knowing I don't want people to just believe me. I want people to push back, and then I want ultimately people to make their own decisions in their own lives.
What do you make? So I agree with all of that. I think that a lot of what we are very often attempt to do through tinkering, policy making, changing incentives, is actually much more effectively done at a kind of cultural level. And I'll give an example of that from a paper that Melissa Carney did. She's a Maryland economist who's actually, you'd love her work, I think. Her recent book is called Two-Parent Privilege, and it's all about this issue of marriage and family. And she's really taken on this kind of very difficult debate, particularly on the left, around two parents being better than one. She does it brilliantly. She did a study earlier where she showed that the MTV show 16 and Pregnant had a huge impact on teen pregnancy rates.
Really?
Much more than any recognizable government policy. And the reason that they were able to track that was because that show aired at different times in different states.
Whoa.
And so they had a wonderful natural experiment. And so they could see that show aired in, Nevada at this point in time, and then like in Illinois at this point in time. And they saw the teen pregnancy rate drop and stay lower as a result of that MTV show. So I think that's actually a great data point for your position, which is an MTV show can be much more powerful in shifting a narrative about the pros and cons of becoming pregnant as a teenager than any amount of government policy or certainly government lecturing on it, which tends to fall on kind of deaf ears. And so I agree with that. One of my questions for you is, what do you think of the culture-making institutions right now, specifically around these kinds of issues of gender. One of the criticisms that's made more from the conservative side is that the commanding heights of the cultural economy are really dominated by a very, very progressive worldview, one that may not be kind of being updated, and that's kind of making it harder to kind of get cut through with other cultural messages, whether that's kind of pro-marriage or pro-religion, or I would say from my point of view, like stories about men in teaching or whatever. So I just kind of be very interested, given that you've made the case for culture and storytelling, how would you rate the performance of our current cultural industries against that metric?
I don't have a problem with the culture engines per se. What I have a problem with is censorship, so that you don't know, are there cultural entities that would be putting great ideas into the system, but that system is behind the scenes stopping them from finding their audience? That would bother me a lot. So I operate under the cultural belief that every period in time gets to create the world that they want. And as I get older, some of the changes that people want to make just seem absolutely absurd to me, based on my metric of human flourishing. I don't think the things that they're doing are going to lead to human flourishing. Case in point, open borders. Case in point, the quotas in making sure that the only person you can vote for in a given district is female. Like that is crazy to me. However, I recognize I can't trust myself. I don't want to be dictator. Like, I want to be able to argue that idea and give you data and give you why I think that's absurd. But then I want people to be able to make that decision. And I just fully understand that when any generation has their moment of control, they get to create the world that they want. And so, cool. If you live long enough, if you were that fortunate, you will inevitably look back at the world and go, you guys are making dumb decisions. And that is a question of frame of reference more than it is objective reality. Now, that brings us to something that we just cannot move on unless we touch, because you hit me so hard with something you said, because I realized you have solved a problem for me of why so much of the world seems like they have roaches on their face to me, which is we can't identify the right metrics. And so this is me putting words to what you said. So you're going to go by proxies instead. So having 50% women in government is a proxy for human flourishing. I think you'd be comfortable with that. But since you'll never be able to identify those metrics or measure them accurately, you just have to go by a proxy. And I have a feeling you're just going off of gut instinct about what those proxies would be. My beef with that is that we can tell there are metrics. So for instance, I know somebody who wrote a really amazing book called Of Boys and Men, which details very compellingly statistics that you can look at that show boys and men are in real trouble. And so I would say the data is out there for anybody that's willing to define where they're trying to go, to define what metrics would indicate that we're headed in that direction, and then have the courage to look at the data that we see now and either say, yes, we're moving in the right direction, or no, we are not.
Right. And so a lot here is going to hinge on our selection of metrics.
Yes.
And so if you were to, we spent a lot of time talking about arcane aspects of British politics, gender politics, but you could say we increased the share, we accelerated the share of women MPs, and then entered a decade of the fastest economic growth that the UK has experienced for a significant period of time. Do I think they're related? No. But you could choose a metric, particularly under an umbrella like human flourishing, that would give you that would allow you to kind of post hoc. There's a lot of post hoc rationalization going on. In fact, post hoc rationalization is the kind of ultimate postmodern skill. And so you could do some post hoc rationalization to support that. But I will say this, that I think that probably for reasons that are not related to tinkering or kind of social engineering, that the political class as a whole has fundamentally failed to recognize the real problems of boys and men and the lack of flourishing in so many of our boys and men. And so that's an interest as to why that's happened, like why that failed. If you agree, A, there are real problems facing boys and men. B, the political class as a whole has largely failed to acknowledge, let alone address them. Why is that? I think that's a perfectly reasonable and a criticism I make a lot of the political class as a whole. Now, as to why that is, I don't know, but I do know that it's true. And I think that that failure on the part of the political class to recognize the problems of boys and men is in and of itself now part of the problem, because it means that so many boys and men feel unseen and unheard. And in a way, I think that's a kind of mirror image of how a lot of women may have felt previously, which is that just, I don't feel seen, I don't feel heard, I don't feel like the issues that kind of women are confronting, this is a big part of the women's movement, are being properly addressed and not being seen and not being heard. And that's one of the reasons why there's a big argument for having more female representation, because it's a sense that you're going to be seen and heard. And so here, I guess I'm going to argue against myself, because although US politics is still skewed male, there has been a huge failure in seeing male problems. Now, as to why that is, as I said, I don't know, but the downstream consequences of that failure are ones that we're still coming to terms with now.
If you run a small business and your goal is to stay competitive and grow effectively in 2024, then you need to make sure you have a killer CRM, one that allows you to connect with your customers' needs like never before. HubSpot's Starter CRM Suite provides your small business with the essential tools, education, and support you need to grow efficiently. Attract new customers, automate your outreach, save time, and connect better with your customers with HubSpot, the most powerful and easy to use customer relationship management software. With integrated marketing, sales, and customer service tools, you have everything you need to efficiently build your business in no time. Find out why over 200,000 customers from more than 130 countries trust HubSpot to bring their team, tools, and data together all in one place. And that includes the Impact Theory team, by the way. Click the link below to try HubSpot for free today.
Well, so I have a hypothesis about what happened. It's something I'm sure you've heard about, a lot of the audience will have heard about, but you had a slow march through the institutions of a hyper progressive agenda to elevate marginalized, so-called marginalized voices. And when you have 30, 40 years of putting students through that cultural machinery, well, on the other side is going to be a culture of people who believe that America is an oppressive nation, it was founded on oppression, that men are problematic, that men should feel bad about what they've done, they should feel bad about their more masculine impulses and tendencies, and those things are bad, and that men are basically broken women, and if we're going to fix you, you're going to act more feminine. So people need a narrative. They need to understand the world around them, and a large way that they get that education is through the school system. And so again, if you spend 40 years putting people through that system, a system that is increasingly that, because first they go through as students, then they come back as educators. So now the next batch of students has this sort of double reinforced thing. And it is not surprising to me that we've seen, despite the fact that men remain in politics, I would say largely because of biology. So I'm sure you've seen these studies where it's like, if you show, I can't remember if it's toddlers, but you show really young kids just pictures of a guy's face from a real election, and they can accurately predict the person that's going to win just based on the features of their face. So it's like usually the taller person wins. Like this is not culturally inculcated stuff. This is your history is a red and tooth and claw thing. And when you want somebody to lead, you're going to want the person that's going to be out front of the battle, that has military intelligence, that knows how to take on a foe. And so that's just so ingrained in us. In the same way that we're afraid of snakes, we turn to the bigger, stronger, more intelligent person to lead. It just is what it is. And I would say that the same march to the institutions that has painted this oppressor-oppressed narrative has also painted a picture of biology doesn't matter, we're a blank slate. It's all discombobulating. It makes no sense, and has led to the weird things that we see, which is, hey, it's still all run by men for the biological reasons that I just laid out, and men aren't thriving because of that shift of like, well, men, you don't have any position. All of your instincts, you're told, are bad. And so you do that and you just get the pulling back, no sense of meaning and purpose, not knowing what their role is, which I think if you want to put a human being in hell, rob them of meaning and purpose and don't let them kill themselves. And I know that sounds terrible, but living without meaning and purpose is horrific. That's why people with no meaning and purpose commit suicide.
Yeah, so the points, there's a point of disagreement and then a point of significant agreement, I think, between us on this. Number one is around the kind of leadership qualities. And because we've been talking so much about the UK, and I just have to go back to Margaret Thatcher when the Argentinians invaded the Falkland Islands in 1982. Every single man around her said, "We cannot get them back. They're the other side of the world. It just costs so much money and lives, and it's just not worth it, Prime Minister." And one of her admirals, "We'd have to send in the whole fleet." And she said, "So send in the whole fleet. Go get them back." So and that was a very impressionable time of my life. And so kind of seeing Margaret Thatcher, a woman, overrule all the military men around her to send the nation to war and to commandeer cruise ships, to fill them with soldiers, to send them, in some cases, to their death, to reclaim these barren rocks of Ireland because, by God, they were British, suggests that it's not only men that can have those characteristics, and the distributions, at the very least, those distributions overlap in terms of those qualities. So that may be the point of disagreement.
I would agree violently with that. That's why I'm saying these are all proxies. Yeah. I care about the outcome. Yeah, so if Margaret Thatcher and a cabinet of women.
But but you said it was biology. You said it was biology.
Correct.
And she's obviously biologically a woman.
Correct. But you have to admit that's the exception, not the rule. So I am for sure not saying that women can't do it. 100% they can. It is possible for any woman to be better than a man at something. But once you start going on to the averages, now all of a sudden it's like the averages begin to matter.
Sure. And I think that's the point. One of the points of agreement is, and maybe this is a good way to kind of loop back some of the discussions we had earlier. Somebody once said that a huge amount of our problems stem from people's unwillingness or inability to imagine overlapping distributions. And to imagine that, so when you say men are taller than women, everybody knows what you mean by that. They know that what you mean is that on average, men are taller than women, right? Not that all men are taller than all women, right? It means that very few of the people over 6 foot are women. I don't know what the number is, but it's a tiny percentage of people over 6 foot. But like a significant minority, I won't say the number because I'll get it wrong, of women are taller than the median man, right? The distributions overlap in terms of height. That's true of lots of the other characteristics we're talking about, right? So there is a difference on average between men and women on a bunch of characteristics, and the distributions overlap. And actually on many of those characteristics, someone like Margaret Thatcher may have been more, quotes, male, right? Or in my case, I'm much more agreeable, which is more a feminine trait, than my wife. She doesn't like me saying that on air, so let's keep that between us and your listeners. But she's much more disagreeable than I am, right? Which is more male, typically. And so the point being that the distributions kind of hugely overlap, and that's just something that people really struggle to get their head around. They either think men like this, women like this, or they think men and women are just the same and everything's socialized. We're tabula rasa. And the only differences between men and women are the ones we learn. And that's crazy. I mean, anyone that's been around men or women or raised them, it's insanity to suggest that everything's socially determined, as much as it is to suggest that everything's biologically determined. So it's if I sound frustrated, it's because it's just a stupid debate. Where I think I agree with you is that recent trends in a lot of political debate, especially around gender, especially on the left, have kind of framed this as quite zero sum, and have in fact kind of cast men as the problem rather than the system as the problem. And that's a real shift away, I think, from the best of the women's movement. The best of the women's movement was kind of looking at structures and rules and various ways in which kind of women's opportunities were being enhanced. And it was very much for women. And I think in recent years, it's become more framed more negatively, and it's become more against men. obviously against, smash the patriarchy, etc. Mansplaining, the rise of the term toxic masculinity, I think, is a really good leading indicator of a very worrying trend, where it was actually about kind of pathologizing certain aspects of male behavior. And so I think that's been a really unfortunate turn in politics. And I'd have to add, though, that the reactionary right has very often done the same thing in saying that, yeah, men are struggling because women are doing too well. And women have to get back. We have to go back on women in order for men to rise again. And so it's frustrating to see both sides very often playing a zero-sum game, but just from different sides, right? As if somehow for men to flourish, women need to do worse, or vice versa. Whereas actually we have to rise together, and we have to see it. Something interesting happened to me recently, which is that Melinda French Gates, who's one of the leading philanthropists around kind of women's rights, tapped me to spend $20 million of her money on boys and men. And that's a surprising move. A lot of people were surprised by that. But as she said publicly since, it's because it's not good for women and girls if boys and men are struggling. Right? And so there you have one of the world's leading feminists, I think she would accept that label, recognizing that we have to rise together and that women have a vested interest in male flourishing and vice versa. And I think the ice is really breaking around this now. I think people are over the zero-sum bullshit, and they're ready for a conversation which says, if there is someone struggling to flourish, if we're losing 40,000 men a year to suicide, that is a massive problem. 40,000 every year. It's as many as we lose women to breast cancer. Different kind of problem, but like in terms of scale, and rising. The fact that suicide among young men has risen by a third just since 2010. The fact that we lose so many male lives to drug poisonings now and deaths of despair, etc. The fact that so many men feel unneeded, to come back to your point, being unneeded is death. Like it's either a social or literal death sentence. People are ready to really pay attention to those issues, and they're sick of being told that they can't. Otherwise, it would mean they somehow don't care about women and girls anymore. Like I've really discovered just in the last couple of years, even since we spoke last, I've really felt that the ground is moving here, and that people are perfectly willing to have a conversation about boys and men. So I wrote about it, and everyone said, "Oh, be careful." Now I've created a whole new institute, the American Institute for Boys and Men. And initially people were like, "I'm not sure about that." Now they're like, "Yeah, sure, fine." It's becoming boringly normal now, right? We do research, we do policy, we're worried about boys and men. Sure. And I think within a couple of years, people will wonder why we didn't exist before. So in other words, the normies are winning on this stuff. We are winning. I'm a self-declared proud normie. And I just think that being able to think two thoughts at once and recognize that paying attention, real attention to the problems of boys and men in a respectful and a compassionate way does not mark you out as a frothing at the mouth misogynist. We're winning. But we haven't won. There's still a lot of obstacles to this. But I have to tell you, I've been pleasantly surprised by people's willingness to have this conversation.
I love that. It's great. On the surface, I think we agree on most things, but I can tell you feel that there's a thing that we disagree on, which we do. To put a fine point on it, it is the base assumption of whether tinkering is going to lead us somewhere good, or whether the second and third order consequences that can't be seen by default, you should just assume they're going to be problematic. I think that's where we disagree. But now that we've planted a flag, A, because I'm extremely convincible, and B, even if you can't convince me, I'm still very sincerely interested as a self-proclaimed policy wonk, somebody that is building an institute to think about these things. With the 2024 election coming, do you hear policies coming out of the Harris and Trump camps that make you optimistic about the future of a non-zero-sum game for men and women?
No. That's the short answer. The short answer is no, not yet. At a national level, I find politics to be pretty frozen in a zero-sum position on issues of gender. And I think that is likely to deepen. We'll see. Obviously, Harris, whilst it's new, But certainly all the signs I've seen so far is, if anything, it will deepen, because actually the Republicans are attracting a lot more support from young men, whereas young women are tending more liberal. Obviously, the Democrats are running on a very kind of pro-women agenda, not least around reproductive rights, etc. But even things like college debt cancellation is massively popular among women, not so much among men. And so there's lots of issues where they're kind of trying to win by turning out women's votes to a very significant extent, including suburban women, around some of those issues. Meanwhile, there has been a move among men, as I said, young men, but also Black and Hispanic men. We'll see if that continues to the Republicans. And so you'll see J.D. Vance in particular, but kind of Trump really doubling down, I think, on this kind of anti-feminist rhetoric, the childless cat ladies stuff that we've heard from Vance and others. And they'll do that because they actually, that it's working to some extent. They're actually kind of, if there are men out there who feel like, things have gone too far, or that men aren't being treated properly, or they're not being respected, etc., then I think Trump and Vance they have a certain affect and a certain set of messaging that can draw them. But when it comes to policy, there's just nothing on either side. I just think they're just dug in. And an example of that would be, I don't know if you know Senator Josh Hawley or his work at all. No. He's the Missouri senator. He's written a book called Manhood, and he's really very interested in these issues. And what I find interesting is that when the bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed, which was the first major piece of legislation, really helped working class men. Most of the benefit went to working class men because it's construction, transit, and the Democrats did everything possible to avoid that conclusion. Right, when they were asked about it, they would really dodge the question. They wouldn't say this is good for working class men. They couldn't say that. And then Josh Hawley, and I would say Trump Vance, who say that they're on the side of working class men, a lot of them are against, and Josh Hawley voted against the infrastructure bill. Right? And so there's this kind of weird issue here where the people who claim to be on the side of boys and men actually don't have policies to do anything to help them. And the people who are interested in policies, the policy wonks more on the left, actually just aren't right now addressing the issues of boys and men. That said, at the state level, at the kind of governor level, at the state level, there's a lot more going on. You're seeing moves to try and get more men into teaching. Washington State is considering a commission on boys and men, and they're obviously a more progressive state. The governor of Utah has created a task force on the well-being of boys and men. And there are a number of governors and education secretaries who are kind of engaged in this. So once you get away from the national level, at a state level, there's just a much better conversation going on. So I've been really pleased by the movement there. Let's see what happens after November. I'll give you one, if super nerdy, this isn't just in the weeds. This is in the weeds within the weeds. This is in the roots of the weeds. It's so boring. But there's something in the White House called the Gender Policy Council. It replaced the Council on Women and Girls, renamed itself, but only addresses issues of women and girls. So it's called the Gender Policy Council, but doesn't do anything about boys and men. Even when there are massive gender gaps going the other way, it just won't do it. It's baked in that it will only do it one way. I think it's quite likely that if Harris wins, she'll just keep it like that. And it's quite likely that if Trump wins, he'll abolish it. He'll just say, this is a bunch of woke nonsense. I'm getting rid of that, right? I can imagine that actually working for his base. He'd probably agree too, because it's very tinkery, right? It's a gender policy council, for goodness sake. It's another piece of the government. I would want either of them to expand its remit to actually try and work across departments to tackle some of the issues facing boys and men. Right now, I don't see either candidate being willing to keep the Gender Policy Council, but broaden its remit so that it actually looks at the problems of boys and men. I think the Democrats will keep it in its current asymmetric mode, and the Republicans are quite likely to abolish it. I don't know. They haven't stated a position on that. And so I'll give you that as an example of what I would consider my sort of boringly moderate centrist tinkerer position on this, which is say the Gender Policy Council would expand it, is unlikely to find favor at a national level. But that's exactly the kind of thing that's happening at state level.
I like to think of it as the sexy center. And as somebody who also finds himself, right, pole dancing in the sexy center.
In the middle of the White House.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's troubling, and it's troubling because it feels so accurate. But what do you think about Harris's historical, I don't know if she's going to update her thinking, but her historical hard push for DEI equity? that really turns me off. I am wildly opposed to equity, meaning equal outcome. I don't think there's any way to do that except tyrannical top-down control. But maybe you have a different read. What do you think?
Well, I don't do political punditry. The last senior politician I advised was Nick Clegg when he was Deputy Prime Minister of the UK. And after I advised him, his party went down to its biggest electoral defeat since World War II. So since, my phone hasn't been ringing off the hook since then for political advice, and I'm genuinely non-partisan. It's very easy to appear non-partisan when you're actually non-partisan, I've discovered. So I'm not. And so I obviously don't know what either campaign will say about this, but I do have views about DEI and equity. And my basic view on this is that if you feel as if this, I think, is consistent with our conversation. If you feel like the push for diversity, equity, inclusion, obviously you have to define what you mean by those terms. But if it's basically about trying to ensure more opportunities, leveling the playing field, reducing barriers, and if you feel like that's being driven by the data, by the empirical evidence, rather than by a fixed ideology, then I think it doesn't run into some of the challenges that it's run into now. And so, for example, on college campuses, one of the things I will say to kind of college leaders, etc., they will sometimes find that their DEI programs, and this is obviously happening in a lot of states now, they're being shut down or defunded and so on. And what I'll often say to them is, well, we've seen your numbers, right? You have a huge problem with male enrollment, with male completion. Your own surveys show that men do not feel included on your campus. So where in your DEI strategy is the stuff for men, right? And if it isn't there, then it's reasonable to worry that your strategy is not actually being driven by your data. It's being driven by some fixed ideological views about who you should be providing equity to. And if you've baked into your definition of equity that it can't possibly include men, then you've just revealed your hand, and you've shown that your agenda is not being driven by evidence, it's being driven by ideology. And that's a frustration for me, because I do think that a lot of the arguments that are made around diversity, inclusion, and even equity, depending on how you define it, are pretty strong. It's just that it's not being applied even-handedly, right? So, like, where are the men's resource center? Where are the male success centers? Where's the outreach to men? What are you doing? Like, what are you doing for men on your campus as part of your DEI agenda? And by the way, just from a tactical point of view, if you wanted to save your DEI office from being shut down by, it would be largely kind of Republican lawmakers, what if you could turn around to them and say, well, we're doing this whole thing for white rural men because we've discovered that white rural men are not doing well on our campus? Do you make it a bit harder for them to shut you down, wouldn't it? I'm not saying he wouldn't shut you down, but it would make it harder, because you could say, look, we just go to where we've looked at our data, we've seen where we lack diversity, we've seen where we lack equity, and we've seen who doesn't feel included. And guess what? A bunch of them turn out to be men. And so a big part of that agenda is men, but that never happens. And so to some extent, I think so many of the people who are pushing the equity agenda are shooting themselves in the foot by not following the data. So for what it's worth, that's my current view on it. And that means, of course, that we might, the horrible cliche, throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what I find interesting is that these very small efforts that we see on college campuses now to help men, they're usually out of the DEI office. So they're getting shut down as well, ironically. So even in the places where they have done it, too little, they're getting shut down as well.
That's really interesting. The idea of following the data, obviously that is speaking my language. I'm really here for that. I just worry tremendously about trying to steer towards equal outcomes just because everybody is so different, even if just at the level of intellect, level of desire. Like, you're never going to get an entire population there unless you tell everybody to slow down to the lowest common denominator, which I very much don't think we want to do. But speaking to actually helping men, I want to put to you what I think is legitimately the hardest question in what's going on with men right now, which is, through all of human history, we have averaged twice as many women having, or us having twice as many female ancestors as we have male. There have been times post-agriculture where that number was as high as 17 women reproducing for every one male. Those numbers are terrifying beyond belief to me. And one solution that I see that will make it very clear how people think through this problem is AI companions and sex robots, and especially one coming together. Because now, for the first time in human history, we may be 7 to 10 years away from every man being able to have a thriving sexual, they won't be able to reproduce, but a thriving sexual relationship with a companion that they can be intimate with, and no one need be left behind from that perspective. The reproduction part is different, but what do you think about that? Terrified or encouraged?
Yeah, I have mixed feelings is the honest answer. And the twice as many ancestors fact is one I like. I haven't heard the 17 to 1 one before. I'd love to learn. Maybe you can send me something about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things I find really striking is there's lots of discussion of AI girlfriends, not much discussion of AI boyfriends, which I think is pretty good evidence that there are differences between men and women when it comes to sex. But someone said, but there could be AI husbands. And that actually, I have a friend who got the AI to talk to his wife when she was having trouble at work. And she said, actually, the AI is doing a better job than you, because he would get frustrated and just want to fix it and he wanted to go and watch the ball game. Whereas the AI was just had all the time in the world, was very thoughtful and just said, God, that must have been so difficult for you. Tell me more about that. And how did that make you feel? So he just left the AI playing while he went to watch the ball game. And so the intriguing idea is that AI might substitute better for husbands in terms of relationships, but substitute for men in terms of sex. So the reason I have mixed feelings about it is because I think that, to go back a little bit, the problem of surplus men, which is the one you're pointing to with those statistics, is a problem that every society has had to deal with. What do you do with the men who are not going to reproduce? And of course, monogamy, basically, as Joe Henrich shows, really kind of largely solved that problem. By actually doing monogamy, it meant that most men would at least have a chance of mating, if not reproducing. And that massively changed those numbers just in the last few centuries. But it's still been a problem. What do you do with the men? And we've had this growing problem of surplus men in the last few decades as well, kind of men who are not marrying, maybe men who are not in the labor market. But that's coincided with the rise of technology, and in particular, video games and pornography. And so we may have talked about this before, but I think it's quite interesting that as we've seen more and more men at a loose end or without clear role, you would have predicted that we'd see a massive rise in crime and antisocial behavior. But the opposite's happened, with few obvious exceptions. But like, crime and disorder has gone down during the period where more and more young men, especially, have had less to do. In every previous era of human history, that would have predicted more disorder and crime. Those men would have been acting out on the streets. It would have been more like Mad Max, on the streets. But actually, the opposite's happened. And I think part of that is because of games, and they've had somewhere else to go, somewhere else in some ways quite attractive and quite enticing. And so you could, if that's right, if the screens have to some extent saved us from what would otherwise potentially be some of the worst cultural consequences of male lack of purpose, redundancy almost. Okay, maybe the counterfactual would have been a lot worse. Just fast forward that to AI girlfriends. Well, what's the counterfactual? If the counterfactual is men with good, healthy, in-person relationships, then AI girlfriends, in my view, worse. If the counterfactual is nothing, maybe better, right? And I just think that's a really difficult position to take. I would suggest, though, that if we do end up with massive demand for artificial forms of intimacy, including sex, but more generally, we should treat that very seriously as a symptom of a lack of human flourishing, to use your good. I don't want to be judgmental about it, and I'm being quite careful what I say here. But I would say, in general, the evidence would suggest to me that over the long run, especially, that real human relationships are much more conducive to human flourishing than anything that you're likely to get with an AI. And so if human flourishing is the goal, that trend, were that to happen, should really trouble us. And if we see more and more young men resorting to that, whilst it may not be bad in itself, I think it's a very bad sign.
It is a bad sign in terms of how many people are being left behind. But if let's just assume that it's 50% and that because the stat that I was talking about, I think they're being very careful to denote that before agriculture, no one could amass resources because resources you had to go kill in real time to eat. But once agriculture comes along, now you can amass real wealth. And now suddenly one person, I've heard you say, I think it's utterly brilliant. You mentioned it, I think earlier, but would you rather be the third or seventh wife of Jeff Bezos or the only wife to an unemployed steelworker? And that's what history is up until agriculture, it was probably 2-to-1. Just given where we're at. And then at some point you're able to get these disproportionate, but it's really only in the last, call it 10 to 12,000 years, which is a blink in the eye of evolution. Okay. So if it's a 2-to-1 ratio.
Yeah. And that yes.
No, please.
Yeah. No, I was just saying that relates to the fertility question you raised earlier, which is that one of the interesting trends, and I'll just put the data point, is that until about 10 or 15 years ago, most of the decline in fertility was of people having fewer children, right? So having 2, not 3, say. But since about 10, 15 years ago, it's been fewer people having children that's driving it. And that's a very different kind of issue. That's a big change in kind of what's driving it. And I wasn't so worried about it when it was kind of people having fewer children. I think it's a more troubling sign about human flourishing if it's more people not having children, unless you had strong evidence they didn't want children, right? And the evidence for that is not that strong. It typically is people who otherwise probably would have had children, but for whatever reason don't. And one of the reasons they point to is because there aren't any men around that they want to have children.
Yeah, that is probably too complicated for this interview. It's worth an interview unto itself. But where I was going is, if you have this 2-to-1 ratio, then forever, all throughout human history, you've had this problem to deal with. And up until now, there really hasn't been a solution. I don't think anybody except the most distressing among us would ever say, well, women should just marry a man that they're not into to make sure that that man isn't lonely. So assuming that no sociopaths are around, and we are not suggesting that.
It's a very bad sales pitch to women, isn't it?
Terrible. So assuming that we're not talking about that, now you have literally, for the first time ever, you have an ability for those people not to get left behind. And so for me, even though I live in perpetual terror of second and third order consequences, and I really cannot see around this corner, and of course it will never be all the people that they maximize themselves, did everything they could, and they still can't find somebody that's interested in them. And so they turn to this. It will be, for many people, just going to be the default because the AI is not going to reject you. It's going to embrace you. So I'm ecstatic that for the first time in human history, we have a solution. I'm terrified for all the questions that it begs, but let's, for the thought of a thought exercise, or for the sake of a thought exercise, let me put it to you this way. How would you want the AI companion / sex robot to be programmed? So my wife, for instance, has shaped me, and both through approval and disapproval. Would you want the AI wife, we'll just assume wife, would you want the AI wife or husband to shape their significant other through encouragement and discouragement?
To say that I'm out of my lane and comfort zone would be an understatement. I just want to say one other thing, maybe to buy a bit of time, but like, we did have a solution. It was called monogamy, and it worked pretty well. So we had polygamy for in most societies, right? And that caused this 50-50 ratio. The two, men only had a 50% chance of reproducing because you don't actually need that many men, right? So some men were doing a lot more, were reproducing with a lot more than one woman. Monogamy came along, largely as a result of the church, and this, I'm just really channeling Joe Henrich's work here. And so for a long time, that's sort of a pretty good solve. And because women basically had to marry to survive, then that lasted quite a long time as a solution, quote unquote, to the problem of surplus men. You didn't have surplus men because the women had to marry to survive, and men were only allowed to marry one, right? So do the math. I think the issue is now is that we're entering a new phase. And I talked to Joe Henrich a bit about this myself, which is that I don't think that we're going to go back to polygamy in any big way. I mean, obviously there's discussion about polyamory. I think instead what's going to come after monogamy is celibacy, a single life for both men and women, which is one of the reasons that we see this decline in fertility, and which I do think in the long run, obviously there are lots of exceptions, but it's kind of bad for long run human flourishing. There's this phrase in kind of China, the empty branches. I think it's either Japanese or Chinese. Like you get to old age and you just don't have any relatives. And that's just not great, especially for flourishing in old age. But to come back to a question, I'm desperately trying to draw on any kind of well of knowledge that would allow me to kind of answer that question about kind of AI robots. And I just don't think I've got anything good to say about it. And so I think I'd probably better just duck the question altogether, because I'll be honest and say, I can't help but not feel a little bit dystopian in even contemplating it. And so it almost gives a bit too much credence to the idea that we're going to be reliant on AI for me to feel comfortable with it.
Okay, I'll see if I can draw you into those waters in a minute, but first I'll take the bait of what you've handed me. So how is culturally enforced monogamy not forcing women to choose a man they would not otherwise be with?
Say that again. I didn't
So
understand.
we had said earlier that neither of us would want to see women be forced to choose a man that they don't want.
Sure.
In a world where dating apps have proven that women just aggregate to sexual encounters with a very small number of men, so that most men are not being successful on dating apps. And when I say successful, I mean penetration. Most men are not having sex with women, and most women are gravitating towards a much smaller subset of men. So one man is having sex with multiple women. So women are saying, when you give me this technology and the ability to choose, I would rather be with the popular guy with the access to resources and be the 17th girlfriend than be the first and only girlfriend to somebody who I think is beneath me. So the question has been asked and answered. So now that we know the question has been asked and answered, and you have men being forced into celibacy, and you have women that are saying, no, I'll have these flings or whatever, and I may not end up having kids because I never find anybody to settle down with, but I'm certainly willing to have these sexual dalliances with these very high status males. Okay, so maybe we're not calling it polyamory, seems like it rhymes to me, but if that's where people left to their own devices settle out, if we turn to monogamy and go, well, this was really a good solution, how would that not be in the modern context forcing them to be with somebody they wouldn't otherwise be with? Now, it's cultural enforcement. It is not governmental enforcement. It's not being done by physical force, but how is that not enforcement nonetheless?
Right. So I think that I think it's a mistake to extrapolate from what's happening in dating apps and dalliances and very short-term relationships, perhaps largely based around sex, to people's preferences for long-term relationships. And so I think you've described, as far as I know, what's happening on dating apps very accurately. But I take at face value the fact that most people will say that they do want a long-term relationship, that they do want to probably have a family, and that very often women say the problem is not on the demand side, it's on the supply side, and that they just can't find men with whom they are willing to have children, and that maybe they've expected men to do more of the maturing before the relationship, before the marriage, than in the past, where the men would mature through marriage. And so I actually do think there was something to the fact that kind of marriage kind of was a institution that help men to mature, to kind of to be civilized, to use some other language that people use. Whereas I think now women are saying, no, I'm not civilizing you. You get civilized first, right? You get mature first. You get your act together first, and then I might marry you. That's a massive change. And I think that kind of a lot of men are really struggling with that shift, even if they don't think about it that way. And so no coercion, but take at face value that is probably what most people want, and do everything we can to help men to be better partners and better husbands and be better prospects. I mean, I do think there's something to the fact that improving the kinds of men that are on the market, to use this terminology, is a big part of it. And that will be, so I don't think we solve the problem by in any way, I mean, you've made it clear, you mean culturally, but even culturally suggesting to women that they should marry men that they don't feel that they are happy with. We should create men that they will be happy with. And so that brings us back to, I think, where we started, which is the challenges that men are facing in their physical health, their mental health, their education, their sense of themselves, their efficacy, all of the things that men are really struggling with are not only hurting them, they're hurting the marital prospects of their female peers. And I find it super interesting that when I talk about these issues of men, middle-aged women, sort of women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, they're like, really? Like, is that right? Because they've faced a lot of glass ceilings, maybe. They're kind of, that doesn't sound right. Women in their 20s, regardless of their politics, they get it straight away. Because we're talking about their peers. And so it's interesting that you don't have to do as much convincing of the typical 25-year-old woman as you do the typical 55-year-old woman that young men are struggling. Because it feels existential for those young women. And I presume, based on some pretty good evidence, that most of those young women would actually prefer everything equal at some point to find a partner and have children with that partner and raise those kids together. That is still the stated preference of most young women. So I don't think it's a problem of what people's preferences are. I think it's a problem of finding someone who can do that. I do worry a lot that right now, young women and young men don't feel very aligned in their interests. They feel, if anything, like they're separating, not only kind of physically and romantically, but also, and I said politically, but just culturally. I kind of think there's this kind of growing gap between young men and young women. And that really troubles me from all kinds of perspectives, not least family formation.
Yeah. So I think that you've got your finger on a potential solution, which is for men to rise up. Let me ask, do you think that China's policies are going to output men that women will prefer compared to what we're doing here in the US currently, which is letting them flounder?
Which policies do you have in mind specifically? You may know more about this.
Yeah, so this is utterly fascinating. In fact, I have a quote here that I pulled during my prep. So according to the BBC, a top Chinese official said, and I actually went and read this, so I will agree, this is what it says. There is a trend among young Chinese males towards feminization, which would inevitably endanger the survival and development of the Chinese nation unless it is effectively managed. And so they're doing all kinds of stuff that there's like a whole list of proposed policies. I don't know how many of these they have or will implement, but this was the the educational body making a proposal that they wanted the government to basically sanction. And they said, we want more focus on physical education, getting the boys out there, playing sports, being aggressive, getting physically fit. We want more former athletes as physical education instructors. They're putting huge limitations on the amount that people under 18 can play video games. And there was a couple other things designed basically to get getting stars that are represent a very masculine, muscular physique, so that people that are being celebrated to the country represent that sort of male, traditional male. They didn't say like 80s action hero, and I doubt they mean something like that, but the images, at least in the article, were just guys that were ripped, they had muscles, and they were in the middle of doing very physical things. But just they're just stating outright that they're worried that Chinese men are becoming feminized in and of itself is pretty interesting. And given that they are so prone to controlling their populace through policies that are very difficult to sidestep, like they'll just shut off your internet, or they won't let you spend money on things that they deem unworthy. So do you think, draconian or not, that will end up outputting men that women are more satisfied with?
Yeah, I mean, you say they don't tinker, the Chinese.
No,
they're not.
It's a little beyond that.
Which is, I mean, at the very least, as a social scientist, I'm excited by the opportunity to research it.
Agreed.
And what I hope they'll do, what would be great is if they introduce these rules, say the internet rules or the gaming rules, at different times in different provinces, so that again we get a nice natural experiment. There's this really good work showing the impact of the one-child policy on the number of surplus men later. And they could do that because the one-child policy was introduced at different times in different Chinese provinces. And so you could literally time it till 18 years later. So look, I mean, as you go through the list of things, and by and large, I don't think starting off by kind of telling men that they've become too soft and feminine is a great PR approach. So I would say that's bad messaging. But in terms of like the specific things you've mentioned, like I think it's quite hard to argue against most of them, right? I don't freak out about video games like some people. I worry that it kind of pushes out some other activities. I worry a lot about the lack of physical health. And boys, and this is true for boys and girls, but for kind of boys and men especially, I think kind of lack of physical activity seems to be particularly damaging. So I worry a lot about that. So more of that would be good. So on the face of it, some of this stuff looked interesting. And even the role model stuff seems okay. It's just that you don't want to do that. So here I'll end up agreeing with you. You just generally don't want to do that through kind of top-down policies. And I think that if it feels top-down, it's much less likely to succeed than if it feels organic. But one of the things I'm very interested in now, if you look at people who are online and the sorts of podcasts, perhaps including this one, that a lot of men kind of might listen to, or the sort of figures they turn to. Of course, you've got the kind of extreme manosphere, men's rights types. But what I find quite interesting is how many people are attracted to more of the kind of fitness types. I'm thinking about people like Andrew Huberman and Peter Attia. You mentioned David Goggins earlier, and so on too. Like these are men who no one would think of as in any way kind of crazy or reactionary or anything. They're all about like living well and a lot of fitness stuff. And so I'm very struck by how many young men are really into that kind of thing. And so I think what's happening there is that a model of masculinity, if you like, that's largely being refracted through discussions about physical health. And so it's not threatening to a lot of men, but they embody a certain way of being male that's very attractive and very aspirational to boys and young men. And that's good, right? We should want them to aspire to be physically healthy, to be strong, right? That's good. That's just good for your health. Right? And if those men are also they have a way of being in their conversation that's aspirational as well, that's amazing. And so I'm picking on Andrew Huberman, but like you take someone like Huberman, who's just all about, he's just geeky scientist, fitness guy, but he's also, fit, and he talks a lot about his own fitness and so on too. He has a huge following among young men. That's awesome. I don't think the Chinese government saying you should be like Andrew Huberman or whoever the Chinese Andrew Huberman is a very effective strategy. I think what's great is if Andrew Huberman exists and millions of young men flock to him. Awesome. That's happening organically. And it also shows you that is really what young men are interested in. And will that help to create more marriageable men, more mateable men? Let's hope so.
Yeah, I agree. I think putting it out into so let me state the answer to my own question simply. Yes, I think that by focusing men on an ideal that is more masculine, that will pay off in terms of creating men that women are far more likely to be attracted to. Now, if you leave out things like emotional intelligence, a desire to see your partner thrive, you're going to have problems. So if you're hearkening back to sort of caveman style, no, that's not going to work. But I think it is very instructive if men look at the female version of pornography, which is the romance novel. I'm sure some people will take exception to that until you read one, and then you realize it really is pornography for women. And that breaks into these just super clear-cut archetypes of the pirate, vampire, werewolf, billionaire, doctor, and I think there's one other. But it's like that women just go...
Cowboy?
Yeah, basically, women are going for, it's the Beauty and the Beast archetype. They want to tame the untamable man who, through their sort of feminine wiles and sexual prowess, they are able to tame this all-conquering beast that for nobody else could get access to this sort of inner gooey center of emotional communication and attachment. That's the female fantasy. And so once you understand, oh, you can actually become that, but you have to be an integrated beast and have that gooey center that can be accessed, that you can be articulate and loving and committed. And if you can find a path to that integration, then you've got a real shot. And if you can't, then you're going to be in trouble. All right.
Yeah, I find those sort of fantasy things instructive and interesting, as long as we always remember, of course, that they're kind of fantasies. But I was struck, I actually ran across a news article the other day which said that romance novels are really booming among Gen Z women. So young women in particular seem to become turning to those novels. And I was frustrated with the way it was reported, because then it kind of talked about the lack of diversity in the authors, which I thought kind of missed the lead, which is how interesting that kind of young women are turning to these kind of romance novels. And so I talked to some young women about it. This is one of my son's friends were over, and they were like, well, it's because a lot of those young women feel they lack it in real life. Now, of course, you can have it in real life and still want the fantasy and so on too. I'm not suggesting that they're counterposed, but nonetheless, it was instructive to me that there's a danger that in some of our slightly antiseptic approaches to sex ed and to relationships and to a kind of risk aversion in some ways, that we do take some of the romance out. And that actually being able to successfully navigate those romantic relationships is part of growing up. We actually published a piece by Daniel Cox, who's a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, on why he's worried that teens aren't dating as much. So whilst it's good news that teen pregnancy's down, and it may be good news that teens are having sex later, it's not good news that they're dating less. And the reason he believes that, and I believe this too, is that because it's through those earlier dating experiences that you learn a lot of those skills. Like, it's hard. There's rejection, there's misunderstanding, there's kind of how do you like, it's one of the most difficult areas of human life to navigate, right? That entering the zone of kind of romance. And I worry a lot about de-skilling. I worry a lot that both young men and young women, but perhaps especially, are getting de-skilled around that. And then they hit the kind of world of romance, the world of dating and actually Dan Cox is writing a book about this, like in their mid-20s, and they're still pretty unskilled. Right? So they've maybe got the skill level of yesterday's 17-year-old or whatever you want to say. And so they blunder and they don't really know what they're doing, and they lack confidence and they get it wrong. And so anyway, it's a long answer, but I'm really interested in what's happening to young people romantically, and a bit troubled by the signs that there's been this progressive de-skilling, because it's difficult, right? And I'm old and I'm in my mid-50s, and like, you learn this stuff the hard way by getting it wrong and learning how to take rejection and so on. And I worry that without the skills, you just retreat. And so this maybe brings us back to where we were a while ago, which is the thing that worries me most about young men in particular, but perhaps men generally, is not the ones who are acting out. There are a few of those, but not many. It's the ones who are checking out. It's the ones who are retreating, sometimes online spaces. And I think it's that sense of male retreat. I think you maybe even used that term before, just kind of backing away from the challenges of work, study, life, self-improvement, right? That is the most troubling of all, right? It's the checked out men that we should be spending most of our time on, but it's the acting out men who get the headlines, rather than the ones who are just quietly giving up, and sometimes most tragically giving up even on themselves.
What do you think they have in common? Have they imbibed an idea that's holding them back? Are they just getting clobbered in an education system that's wildly female?
I think they're coming out of an education system that has not served them well, and that has sent them the message that they're just not very good at this education system, that has not provided them alternatives. I mean, this is a very wonky point to make along the way, but I think that I've written a lot about this, that the lack of vocational training, the lack of hands-on learning opportunities has just been really bad news for boys and men, because the last year or two of high school is just basically just a massive cratering waste of time for a lot of boys. And so they drop out. I mean, they fall off the end of the conveyor belt of the K-12 education system, having basically felt like they failed. And then they maybe try and get some sort of post-secondary education. They really struggle in the labor market. Employers are actually a little bit less likely to want to hire young men than young women now, because they see them as slightly riskier hires. They're struggling in the labor market.
Wait, can you say more about that? I've never heard that before. People consider men riskier?
We've actually, again, I'm just advertising, but we just published a piece by Matt Darling, which had a really nice natural experiment in it, where they basically made it a bit more expensive for employers to fire people in one state compared to another state. It changed the law around unemployment insurance. And what that's an experiment, what that tells you is, if you make it slightly, you make it a little bit riskier to hire people, then see what happens to hiring patterns. And what happened was, by raising the cost of firing people, employers became less likely to hire young men than young women. And so the obvious conclusion there is they just see young men as a little bit riskier, right? That's the natural conclusion, is you raise the kind of, like, am I going to have to fire this person? And if so, that's going to cost me more. Then you're going to be more careful who you hire, right? You're not going to take a risk. And it turned out less likely to hire young men. So you can look at Matt Darling's paper on that. So, but I think more generally, there's just this sort of sense of de-skilling, passivity. And also, I just think back to this question that we've been, I think, talking about a lot in this conversation, which is, a lot of young men will say to me something along the lines of, I've been told a lot about the things I shouldn't do and the things I shouldn't say. So they've effectively been given a long list of don'ts. Don't say this, don't do that, don't think this, don't be like that, right? It's a long list, largely negative, and really no do's. It's back to this point we made earlier about not having a script. And so if they found themselves and their own sense of themselves as boys and men, if it's defined at all, defined largely in negative terms, but still nonetheless being a man, right? I think that leaves them really underpowered, really risk averse, really uncertain about how to engage, and really worried that if they engage and they get it wrong, that they'll be shouted down, or they'll fail, or they'll crash and burn. So better not to try. And so I do think that kind of backing away from some of these challenging situations, which is really what you see, like young men are less likely to leave home than women. They're less likely to move away than women. They're less likely to study abroad than women. And so you're just seeing this kind of sort of the idea of the kind of go west young man adventurer thing is just completely flipped in terms of gender. And it's great that women are doing that, but it's not great that a 24-year-old man is 10 percentage points more likely to be living at home than a 24-year-old woman. Like, it's 34% versus 24%.
Wow.
And so there's just this failure to launch thing that's a trope, but true. And I think that's because we're not telling a good story, to come back to your point about how great it is to be a guy, right? I'll risk saying that, right? And if we don't have stories and role models about how fantastic it is to be male, and we have a lot of stories about what's bad about being male, the resulting asymmetry is incredibly disempowering, especially for men who maybe don't have the resources or the skills to navigate. And so we're navigating much, much more difficult waters now, romantically and economically and socially and culturally. And the guys who have the skills to navigate that water are going to do fine. But the guys who don't are not going to do fine. And they're the ones I'm really worried about.
Why is it awesome to be male?
Isn't it?
I think it is.
Don't you think?
For sure.
Yeah.
But I also grew up in the 80s, so I got a way better story.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. I don't know. Well, I think about a lot about male friends. I think first, like the way that male friendships work, the kind of banter and just the kind of way we lovingly lay into each other. I think that's fun. And I have it with my sons now. I think that's beautiful. I think some of the kind of physicality of being male is great, right? Of kind of a lot of sports and just like that sense of, physical adventure. I think that's great. There's something about, I mean, obviously I can't put myself kind of in the kind of mind of a woman, but I think just male sexuality and sex drive, which is one of the kind of big differences. I think obviously channeled appropriately, all the usual caveats. I think it's great. Right? It's kind of great to be interested in into sex, and it's great to have desire. And I think there's a lot of desire on the male side of the equation sexually, and so I think that's great. And I also think it's great to in some way feel like, because of the physical differences that there are between men and women, to feel like you can to some extent still, if necessary, be kind of physically protective. Now, of course, fortunately, that's much less necessary now. Actually, I was on a panel recently with the governor of Maryland, Wes Moore, and he said, I don't know if you know him, but he's a former paratrooper, US paratrooper, huge guy, incredibly fit guy. And he said, my wife actually says she never feels safer than when I'm at home with her. And I said, it's weird because my wife never says that about me, but she would say that about you, Wes, because he is a formidable physical presence. But that's not quite true, actually. And one of the things that I think that it's okay to say is that there is a male responsibility to look after those who are weaker or more vulnerable than themselves. And so one of the things I've tried to do, and I've said this in various places, so apologies if you heard me say this before, but that as I've raised my 3 boys, all now grown men, all in their 20s, I've tried to raise them to have the courage to ask a girl out, the grace to accept no for an answer. There's no entitlement there. And the responsibility to make sure that either way she gets home safely. And so what's captured in that is a sense of like being willing to put yourself out there, ask a girl out, right? Just being willing to kind of just like go for it. And that's not only okay, it's good that you can win. But then the second bit of it is grace to accept no. You have no sense of entitlement about that. There is absolutely, like, she can say no, it might not work out. Hopefully she'll say no gracefully as long as you've done it gracefully. There's a grace to rejection. But that either way, like, you need to make sure she gets home safely. And I used to have an extension on their curfew. They could actually come home a little bit after their curfew. This is when they were teenagers. If I knew that was because they were getting someone home safely, usually a girl. And I'm sorry, but like my sons are 6'4", and you know they're big guys, and maybe size is not the thing that matters there. But like, if that meant getting someone safely, that's great. It's just a truth. And just very recently I was at a conference and I was with a female colleague about the same age as mine, and she was going to get her car kind of in a covered garage, and I went with her, and I said, would you like me to? She said, oh, thank God you asked, right? But I think a lot of men now actually wouldn't even ask.
For sure.
They'd be worried that would be misconstrued. They'd be worried that you're being sexist or creepy or whatever. And she was like, thank you for asking, right? Because she just didn't want to go in there on her own. She just felt a bit safer to have someone go with her and do that. So anyway, I'm going on a little bit in answer to your question, but there are some aspects of being kind of male that I've listed there that are just a little bit off the cuff, and that are great. And you don't have to say them necessarily, but you just have to show them and kind of be them and make sure that we're, again, not defining this in the wrong way. I just had this, there's a feminist philosopher called Kate Mann, and she just wrote something just today saying, Tim Walz got a model of non-toxic masculinity. And I just said, like, is that the best we can do? Like, really? Like, yeah. And for her, that was a concession, but like, non-toxic masculinity, like, you know, what an exciting vision that you could actually not be poisonous. You could actually not be a pathogen. Yay, you too could be a non-toxic male. I mean, talk about a bad PR campaign. And then we wonder why boys aren't attracted to those messages, which is like, we're going to teach you to not be toxic. And again, more deeply, you're just framing this whole thing in negative terms. It's like original sin. It's like, we're gonna show you how to not be bad. Well, for the love of God, could we not actually talk about how to show you how to be good and what it means to be a good man, not just how to not be a bad man? And that's been a big problem in our cultural discourse over the last couple of decades. We have not done enough of the how to be a good man. We've done too much of the how not to be a bad man.
I love it, man. I totally agree. I always love my time with you. Where can people follow you, read your work?
Likewise. I'd love people to go to the brand new think tank, the American Institute for Boys and Men, and that's just AIBM.org. And I'm on all the usual places with Richard V. Reeves and Twitter, etc. And that's my website address too. But love the conversation. Took us to places that were unusual and discomforting and illuminating. So I thank you for that.
Truly my pleasure, man. Thanks for joining me. Everybody out there, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace. If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more. Do you think men are being taught to be weak right now?
Yes, definitely.
What?
No, it's worse than being taught. They're being enticed toward that in every way.
Tell me more.
And punished for not doing it. Well, they're enticed toward.